Tonight on Greater Boston, while that tsunami-like red wave never materialized, Republicans are still favored to take the House. And in a classic deja vu all over again moment, a runoff in Georgia will likely decide Senate control. Back here in Massachusetts, no such drama. A clean sweep for mostly Democratic women in the statewide races. Boston Globe columnist Joan and UMass political science professor Tatishe Nteta join me on all that. Then two of the people behind the Emmy Award-winning Frontline installation here in Boston, which offers an interactive look at 150 unsolved civil rights era murders. The red wave that wasn't. Although some races are still too close to call, it appears the midterm results haven't exactly been the sweep that so many on both sides of the aisle had expected. In one of the big three states to watch, Pennsylvania voted Democrat John Fetterman into the U.S. Senate, flipping a Republican seat and denying Trump-backed TV doctor Mehmet Oz the job. He was one of several MAGA Republicans who lost their races. At the time of this taping, Arizona and Nevada's Senate races remain too close to call. And once again, Georgia's will go to that runoff in December, all of which are likely to decide the Senate balance of power. Here in Massachusetts, there was a wave, the blue kind, and an historic one at that, with Andrea Campbell officially the first woman of color to win a statewide contest. She'll be the Attorney General. And the current Attorney General, Maura Healey, not only is the first ever woman elected governor in Massachusetts, but the first openly gay woman to be elected governor in the nation.
I want to say something to every little girl and every young LGBTQ person out there. I hope tonight shows you that you can be whoever you want to be.
I'm joined by Boston Globe columnist Joan and Tatishe Nteta, Associate Professor of Political Science at UMass Amherst. Tatishe, Joan, good to see you both.
Good to be here.
Tatishe, let me start with you. With all the history making in Massachusetts last night, will that translate into a different kind of governing or just different people filling the chairs?
And I think that's the central question going forward. I mean, this is the first time maybe in the history of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in which, of course, we have a female governor, but you just look down at all these statewide offices. You have an auditor that's a woman. You have an attorney general that's a woman, a treasurer that's a woman. You have one of the state senators in the U.S. Senate who's a woman. So this is why diversity is important. It brings a different perspective. It leads individuals to ask different questions and bring different evidence to bear to solve the pressing problems of the state. And I think we will see somewhat of a difference in leadership and a difference in the focus on issues as a result of a more diverse set of not candidates anymore, but leaders in the Commonwealth.
Joan, I think it was yesterday you wrote that Maura Healey should thank Charlie Baker for not running. Is she going to govern like Charlie Baker in your estimation?
I think, that is another big question. She really is kind of a mystery as a governor to be. I know that she would disagree with that, but she ran a campaign that was, I think, very cautious, that did not reveal a lot about who she really is and what she really stands for and what her priorities are going to be. And she did really embrace Charlie Baker, and we'll see if that continues, if that embrace continues when he's no longer in the office and she is.
So if we can move on to D.C., starting with you, Joan. Biden has called it last night at least a vindication that the margin was smaller. But do margin in the House I'm talking about, do the margins really matter? It seems to me that if you have a Republican speaker and Republican chairs of committees with a one-vote margin, you have Republican chairs and a speaker with a 40-vote margin. A majority is a majority. Am I minimizing the impact of the narrowness of the victory for the Republicans?
Well, it's kind of like in sports, right? If you lose by 1 point or 20 points, it's still a loss. However, I think politics is also an expectations game. And we went into yesterday really thinking. I mean, I was, sort of following the polls and the pundits.
So was I.
And everybody seemed to think it was just going to be a complete bloodbath. The fact that it isn't, I think, does somewhat change the dynamic and gives Joe Biden, something to crow about, so to speak, but how that translates to actually governing, the not much hope from the Republican side of things.
You know, Tatishe, the only argument I've heard about how the margins matter is that lunatics like Marjorie Taylor Greene, I was going to say Lauren Boebert, but she may actually lose in Colorado, which is pretty stunning, that the crazies like that have more power over the speaker in their own party if there's a narrow margin as opposed to a broad one. Other than that, potentially, does it matter what the margin is for the Republicans in the House, assuming they win the majority, which they appear to be on their way to?
I mean, I agree that a majority is a majority, but you always want a larger majority such that you can ensure that your overarching policy goals are passed. At this point in time, you have each member of the Republican caucus is an important factor in passing anything that McCarthy, if he becomes the sort of speaker, would like to pass. And so this puts the onus on the leadership qualities of McCarthy and whoever decides to be, or whoever the caucus elects as whip, to get those folks in order and in line in order to ensure that the Republicans' vision and their policies are passed.
You know, Tatishe,
Jim, can I just add one thing?
Sure.
What I think is really interesting is how the conservatives, or the pundits at least, have turned on Donald Trump in the aftermath of this, and I think that is probably might give some hope for what happens in Washington.
I want to get back to Trump, by the way, but that you'd refer to him in an inappropriate way. If you read your own columns, he's the despicable Donald Trump, Joan. If you can do that properly, we'd really appreciate that. Can we get back to Trump in a second? I want to stay in Congress for just a minute, if we can. The exit, you're a polling kind of guy, Tatishe, and the exit polls I saw said that two of the areas where Democrats didn't get good news, they lost voters, people of color and white voters without a college education. Assuming those exit polls are right, why?
So, I mean, white voters without a college education have been moving towards the Republican Party for decades. So I don't think that's really any news to the Democratic Party. I think they've had a few candidates that had effectively mobilized white working class voters. You have Fetterman in Pennsylvania and in Ohio. You had Ryan, who many have seen as potentially a playbook to bring those individuals back to the fold. And so I think in 2 years, we'll see what the Democratic Party does. In terms of people of color, I think there's an assumption that African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans are homogeneous. They are like any other group in the country. There are divisions within those groups. And the Republican Party has done an effective job in recognizing those divisions, the issues which mobilize portions of those communities, and getting them to vote for Republican candidates that speak to those particular policies, issues, and preferences. So in some ways, this is a triumph for the Republican Party to potentially break the hold of the Democratic Party over people of color. And that could potentially be beneficial for people of color as well, if they are seen as groups that can be mobilized.
Yeah, meaning that you don't just ask for the vote, you actually have to deliver on a promise that you've made to get that vote. You know, Joan, I quoted you a minute ago talking about the Senate for a minute. Your line in your piece was, "Call me an optimist, but I believe the perpetually despicable Trump also helped Democrats survive the perilous midterms." The conventional wisdom is the perpetually despicable Trump also delivered the majority in the Senate to the Democrats 2 years ago. Because of Georgia with Ossoff and Warnock. Is your perspective that he could play the same role with Warnock in a runoff in December yet again this round?
Well, it looks like, deja vu all over again. I mean, he seems like he can't help himself. The last time around, it was right after 2020, right? It was right after the election. And he just went down to Georgia and whined and complained and made it all about Donald Trump. He's done the same thing in the run-up to the midterms, and I don't think he can help himself. I believe that he will, try to do the same thing. This time around, though, it feels like that people in the Republican Party and the establishment have had enough of him. Maybe they'll just, kidnap him and keep him down in Mar-a-Lago. That's not being kidnapped, but somehow like lock him in his basement or something and just keep him away from Georgia.
I could vote for that. Staying on what moved voters again, Tatishe, I bemoaned the fact on our radio show leading up to yesterday that abortion wasn't nearly as much of a motivating factor as I assumed it would be after the Dobbs decision, and I think I was wrong. When you look at constitutional amendments protecting the right to reproductive freedom in places like California, Michigan, Vermont, and obviously that, to me, a stunning vote against the constitutional amendment banning abortion in a place like Kentucky, that was a driving force that did keep the margin much narrower than expected, don't you think?
Yeah, without a doubt. I think it's an issue that mobilized particularly Gen Z to come out to vote. I think, polls did not particularly capture the importance of abortion. But, if you look at a number of polls, the health of the democracy was one of the central issues that Democrats, progressives, and young people spoke to. And I think that connects with this notion of the abortion decision in Dobbs. It's a highly unpopular decision. A majority and a pretty consistent majority of the nation support a woman's right to choose. And the Supreme Court has gone against public opinion in the Dobbs decision. And this is the chickens coming home to roost in some fashion, that when you make decisions that are unpopular like that and they're connected to a particular policy or a particular party, that party is going to have some electoral consequences in the first election. The question is, going forward, is abortion going to continue to be this issue that mobilizes young people and does damage to the Republicans' chances?
One last thing, Joan, you've been chomping at the bit to get to Trump, so let's do it. He does an interview on News Nation. I don't even know what that is, but it's some right-wing cable network in which he's asked about the candidates he has endorsed, and he gives an answer that is so Trump-like, it is painful. Here is Donald Trump.
Well, I think if they win, I should get all the credit, and if they lose, I should not be blamed at all. And when they do well, I won't be given any credit, and if they do badly, they will blame everything on me.
There was no humor in that for those who were not watching his face as he was speaking. So, Joan, you wanted to... Is he a diminished character this morning as compared to what he was yesterday morning?
Well, I guess I shouldn't pretend to be an expert on, like what the Republicans are thinking, but I think that he is. And if you sort of read the commentary, and all of the attention and focus right now is on Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who is seen as the next, new shiny new object. The front page of the New York Post has a picture of him and his wife and his little kids. That's the future of the party. So, yeah, I think Trump is becoming yesterday's news.
Is he yesterday's?
Maybe I'm an optimist, but I hope that's true.
Tatishe, is she just being an optimist, or is that the reality potentially coming out of yesterday?
I mean, the proof is in some ways in the pudding. He won in 2016 in a very shocking fashion, but Republicans did not do well in 2018. They lost control of the House. In 2020, they lost control of the presidency as well as the Senate. And in 2022, a number of the candidates that he supported potentially could lead to the loss of the U.S. Senate for the Republicans and less than expected gains in the House. And so I think the argument that the Republican leadership needs to make is whether or not this is actually a winner. Is someone hitching our wagon to this particular candidate, this particular former president, might actually do more damage than good electorally. And that's particularly true in federal elections because, Trump mobilizes. He mobilizes his base, but he also mobilizes a large and very emotional and affective opposition. And that's not good for Republicans. High turnout elections historically have not been beneficial for the Republican Party or candidates.
Got to hold it there. Tatishe Nteta, Joan Vennochi, thanks so much for your time, both of you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Next up, murdered more than a half-century ago solely because of the color of their skin, they're almost lost to history. But now, in an exhibit here in Boston, you can read their names, see their faces, and hear the stories that were unearthed as part of a 15-year investigation by the Department of Justice through the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act, which was championed by the late civil rights icon, Congressman John Lewis.
Mr. Speaker, the time has come There are hundreds, maybe even thousands of these crimes that were never brought to justice. There are murders who have walked free for decades while the families of victims cried for justice.
Last year, Frontline and the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern University launched a multi-platform investigative report featuring these stories. It's called Unresolved, and it went on to win an Emmy for interactive media innovation. Now through the end of next week, Unresolved is on display outside Northeastern University. Joined by the project's executive producers, Frontline executive producer and editor-in-chief, Raney Aronson-Rath, and Dawn Porter, a prolific and award-winning documentary filmmaker whose past works include the brilliant John Lewis' Good Trouble, Rise Again, Tulsa in the Red Summer. She was here last with Pete Souza, Obama's official photographer, to discuss her film about him, The Way I See It. Dawn, Raney, congratulations on this, and good to see you both.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
I'm happy
so great to be here.
Thank you. Dawn, starting with you, this is not just a factual retelling of a horrible crime that was unresolved, but an effort to ensure that individuals are also unforgotten. Can you describe what people see at the installation?
Yeah, I think when Raney came to me with the project, and this is something that was internally developed originally at Frontline, the idea was that, sometimes we can get immune to stories of tragedy. And it was, she came with a really simple premise, which is these are people. These are people with families and stories, and they have been identified as being victims of a horrific crime. And we should talk about their lives and not just their deaths. And that really spoke to me. I think when you do, work that I do that focuses on civil rights, but what I really try and do is focus on humanity. And this project really centers the humanity of the victims of these crimes.
Does it ever? Raney, my initial thought was that when you talk to survivors in these situations, they'd be dying to talk about somebody they love. But the flip side is not everybody is Mamie Till, who is willing to relive a nightmare. So what was it like reaching out to survivors to participate in this project?
I think one of the first things that Dawn and I talked about is how to do that carefully and with the consciousness that these are crimes that happened, in some cases, decades ago, and how would we approach the families with care and decency and respect? And what we decided to do is approach StoryCorps. StoryCorps has this incredible tradition of capturing people's stories that are more of an oral history model than a journalism model, even though it is journalism. And the way that we worked with them was really wonderful. They really helped us understand how do you treat people with respect as you're gathering stories. And we worked really closely with StoryCorps to gather most of the stories that you hear in the installation, and then the interactive was in collaboration with StoryCorps. And our producers on our end, they have done their homework. They know exactly what they're hoping to do. And we're also saying to the victims' families, we understand this is generational trauma. Yeah. We understand that the government should reopen these cases. And so this is a way also to reopen that conversation.
Dawn, could you briefly describe quilts are a thread that runs through a lot of this. Can you explain why?
Yeah, quilting has a lot of historical significance in the African-American community and really just in American folklore and history. And so Tamara, who is our creative artist, essentially used the motif of the quilt. Quilt making is part of a way to tell a story. It's a way to connect you with history and family. And really importantly, it's a way to connect you with place. And so by using the quilt motif, which you see in the beautiful, exquisitely woven panels, they're digitally woven, you kind of emphasize that there are layers to this story. And that's really something that the designers, the programmers, the creators, you can see the beautiful artistic, and there's a reverence to the panels when you approach them. that I think is fitting to the subject matter. And I did want to also say one thing about approaching the families,
Sure.
which is this is nothing that you could ever forget. And part of the tragedy of the TIL list, which is a list that was created with all good intentions, is that these families, their hopes were revived, that these murders would be investigated. Mm-hmm. And so part of, that there's this broken promise. And part of what I think is so brilliant about what Raney and the entire team have done is say, we can't necessarily give you full justice, but we can at least give dignity to each person on that unsolved murders list, all of those, 150 plus people.
Raney, can you spend a minute and give dignity to one of the people you did, Alberta Jones, and tell us a little bit about her story, if you would?
And that's how she got me, with Alberta. So that's a good one to start with.
Perfect choice, then. Tell us.
That's a good one. So I learned about Alberta O. Jones from my team at FRONTLINE. Carla Boras and Michelle Meisner shared the story with me. And the moment I heard about Alberta, I just couldn't stop thinking about her. She is an incredible woman. First and foremost, she was the first Louisville woman attorney. And I'm saying, that is a big deal in and of itself. And she's the first woman who is Black who passed the Kentucky bar. I mean, she is an incredible lawyer. And she was one of these really motivated people to help people vote. She really spent a lot of time with the Black community, helping them understand voter restrictions. I mean, this is way ahead of the conversation today. She was there on the front lines. And when she was in her mid-30s, one night she was supposed to meet a friend and she didn't. She was found the next day. And it's been an unsolved murder ever since. And she is on this list. And because her story felt so important to me, I called Dawn and asked her if she would executive produce this with me, because I've known Dawn for a long time. And I knew she would be the right person to partner with me on this. And she is the story that I shared. I just said, if you could hear this one story, why do we not know Alberta Jones's name in America? Why do we not know her name? And that's part of this is saying her life matters, right? She was a leader. She was an amazing, charismatic, wonderful person. And we have so much detail about her life in this exhibit in this journalism.
Dawn, why do you was that the right choice for you, do you think?
I mean, it was so easy to relate to this young woman lawyer trying to help other women in particular, as well as to work on voting rights. She was helping, people who allege domestic violence victims. Yeah. And, the idea that at 34, kind of with her entire life ahead of her, this young Black lawyer in the 1950s was disappeared, that she could be disappeared. And that just felt intolerable. And I think, Raney, we have known each other for a long time. And so she knew that would get me and that I could not sit by while she was disappeared. Yeah. And I'm so glad that I, went on the journey, this creative journey with this remarkable team.
We talked a minute ago about talking to the survivors' relatives of people who were executed in these unimaginable fashions. Here's a little bit from the exhibit from Alberta Jones's sister.
The years you get so that you adjust, but you never forget. And like I tell them, the pain never goes away. Alberta went out of the house a healthy woman and got abducted and beat to death and then thrown away like she was a bag of trash. And nobody has ever been tried for it.
Dawn, you mentioned justice and hopes elevated, which often have been dashed. Has the law, the work you guys have done, have any of these crimes been solved as a result? The list remains. The crimes have not been solved. There are a number of cases where there is still possibility of that. And part of our work as filmmakers, as journalists, what we can do is publicize
that these stories remain and that our system of justice demands that there be some accountability. I was working on the film about John Lewis at the time that I started working with Raney and her team on this project. And Mr. Lewis's words were literally echoed in my head, which is, if you see something that's unfair, unjust, and not right, you do something, you say something. And I think what journalists can do is, maybe we can't solve the crimes or prosecute the perpetrators, but we can say something. And that's what this exhibit will do.
Yeah, and you do it beautifully and powerfully with all your colleagues. Before you go, Raney, I mentioned this is a multi-platform kind of thing. In addition to this wonderful installation outside Northeastern, I think at 400 Huntington Avenue, if I remember correctly, there's a documentary, there's a high school curriculum. The high school curriculum thing really excited me, but then what got me nervous is, I'm assuming there's some states, we just talked about Ron DeSantis a minute ago, where such curricula are not acceptable or allowed. Is that a safe assumption?
I think that's true. Although I would say PBS Learning Media has a great way of getting this curriculum into the schools. And this is one of the most popular curriculums that they've had, because so many people are hungry for this history. And whether it's being taught is the question. And we can't say exactly what's happening there, but the great news is we're in over 60% of the schools. PBS Learning Media is amazing in that regard.
Well, you both and your colleagues have done brilliant and important work, and I really thank you for the time you've given me tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank
Jim,
you for having us.
Thanks, Don. Bye.
Now through next Friday, that's November 18th, you can catch the Unresolved installation in person in Northeastern University's Cabot Quad. You can always dive into the online exhibit at frontline.org/unresolved or at the Frontline Unresolved app. That's it for tonight. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget Ukraine.
Wait, did I just commit a crime? Hey folks, I'm Edgar B. Harwick III from GBH's Curiosity Desk, where you ask questions and I find answers. Today's question comes courtesy of Betty Davis from Gloucester, Massachusetts, who wants to know, is it in fact a crime to remove these labels? Now, you find these guys on pillows, mattresses, even a lot of winter coats, and the reason why is because you cannot see what is inside of those items. Now, today, pillows, for example, are usually stuffed with feathers or cotton or some kind of synthetic material. But according to Maggie Terry, back in the day, they put some pretty gnarly stuff in the stuffing.
I mean, it used to be years ago, they'd throw anything they wanted to into the bedding. Newspapers, dirty rags.
Horsehair, used hospital or hotel mattresses, corn husks.
Sweepings off the floor, part of their lunches, droppings, I mean, anything.
For starters, that's disgusting, and furthermore, it's dangerous and unhealthy. So today, a lot of states require these labels that tell you what is inside of the item, and it is against the law to remove them. Sort of. Retailers and manufacturers can be fined if they remove the labels, but once you buy it or I buy it, if you read closely, most of these end with the line, "except by the consumer." So there you have it. Feel free to rip away. Don't forget to follow and tell us what you are curious about, because hey, I might just look into it for you. I'm Edgar B. Harwick III. Stay curious out there.
Deep in Texas,